The first thing I noticed wrong with the dog on the Tuckerbox was its eyes. After 15 years running freight between Melbourne and Brisbane, I'd stopped at that statue more times than I could count. Fuel breaks, leg stretches, the odd photo for tourists who'd pay $20 for me to snap them grinning beside Australia's most famous loyal hound. But that Tuesday morning in March, something had shifted in the bronze dog's expression. Where there'd always been a kind of patient devotion cast into the metal, now there seemed to be something else. Wariness. Maybe even fear. I stood there in the pre-dawn quiet, diesel fumes from my idling Kenworth mixing with the eucalyptus-scented air, trying to work out what exactly had changed. The statue looked the same, weathered bronze dog sitting atop the old Tuckerbox, commemorating the bullocky's faithful companion who'd waited for his master's return. The plaque told the same sanitized story it always had, about mateship and loyalty in the harsh Australian bush. But something in the angle of the head, the set of the ears, struck me as different. Wrong. "You're losing it, Davies," I muttered, but I pulled out my phone anyway and snapped a few shots. Compared them to older photos in my gallery. The statue hadn't moved, of course. Bronze doesn't shift in the night. But the feeling persisted as I climbed back into the cab and pulled onto the Hume Highway. In my mirrors, the statue seemed to watch me go. That delivery run should have been routine. I'd been hauling general freight for Apex Transport since 2008, knew every truck stop and bypass between the major cities. The Gundagai stretch was familiar territory, rolling hills, the Murrumbidgee River winding through town, and always that statue drawing tourists like moths to a flame. It was reliable work, predictable schedules, the kind of job that let you know where you'd be sleeping each night. But predictable had gone out the window 3 months earlier when locals started mentioning changes around the statue. Nothing dramatic. Just offhanded comments from the servo attendants, the waitresses at the highway cafes. "Funny thing about that old dog," they'd say, then change the subject when I pressed for details. Probably nothing, just different lately. I'd started paying more attention after that, making mental notes each time I passed through. The area around the statue seemed quieter somehow. Fewer tourists lingering for photos. Even the ravens that usually perched on the surrounding fence posts had taken to keeping their distance. Local kids who'd normally climb on the base for snapshots now walked past without stopping. 3 days after that Tuesday morning incident, I found myself with a 4-hour layover in Gundagai while waiting for a connecting load. Instead of catching up on sleep in the cab, I wandered into town properly for the first time in years. The place had changed, not dramatically, but in the subtle ways that happen when tourism starts drying up. Empty shop fronts along Sheridan Street, faded paint on the motel signs, that particular quiet that settles over towns when the money moves elsewhere. The old-timers were still there, though, gathered around the same corner table at Murphy's Cafe, where they'd probably been holding court for decades. I ordered coffee and positioned myself close enough to eavesdrop without seeming obvious. Their conversation meandered through the usual small-town topics, weather, local politics, whose grandkids were visiting when, but I caught the undercurrent of something else. Tension, maybe. The kind of careful not-talking that happens when everyone knows something they'd rather not discuss. It was when I was heading back to the truck that one of them caught up with me. Ted Whitmore, I learned his name later, had to be pushing 80, all sinew and sun damage, walking with the careful precision of someone whose joints had seen better decades. "You're the truckie been asking questions about the dog," he said. "Not really a question," I nodded. "Just curious about the local stories. Been driving through here for years." He studied me for a long moment, those pale blue eyes weighing something I couldn't read. "Stories," he repeated. "Towns full of stories. Question is which ones you want to believe. Try me." Ted glanced back toward the cafe, where his mates were probably watching through the window, then gestured toward a bench under some old river-red gums. We sat, and for a while he just looked out toward the highway where cars and trucks flowed past in both directions. "My grandfather knew Billy Patterson," he said eventually. "The original Bullocky, not the tourist version, the real man." I waited. Experience had taught me that old-timers would tell their stories in their own time, their own way. Patterson wasn't the cheerful teamster they liked to paint him as. Hard man, even by the standards of the 1850s. Had to be, I suppose, hauling supplies through country that could kill you 6 different ways before breakfast. But there was something else about him, something that made people careful. Ted paused, watching a road train negotiate the turn toward town. The dog was real enough. Big black Kelpie cross, devoted to Patterson like dogs get sometimes. But that's where the pretty version ends. What really happened? Patterson disappeared in 1853. Not unusual. Men went missing in the bush all the time back then. Officially, they found his remains weeks later, miles from where he'd been camped. Natural causes, they said. Heat stroke, maybe a heart attack. But my grandfather told different stories. The old man's voice had dropped, forcing me to lean closer. Said Patterson had been acting strange those last months, paranoid, talking about things, following him on the lonely stretches of road. Orders that didn't make sense, deliveries to addresses that didn't exist, payments in gold for cargo that turned out to be boxes of rocks. Sounds like he was losing his mind. Maybe. Or maybe he was getting too close to things that powerful people wanted kept quiet. Ted's fingers drummed against the bench. 1853 was a complicated time around here. Gold rush money, government contracts, lot of opportunities for the right people to get very rich very quickly. Long as nobody asked the wrong questions. I thought about the statue's changed expression. What happened to the dog? That's the interesting part. After Patterson's remains were found, the dog wouldn't leave the spot where his master's wagon had been abandoned. Sat there for weeks, even after they moved the cargo, cleaned up the camp. Local constable tried to catch it, give it a home, but it was having none of that. Just sat and waited. Like the statue shows. Like the statue shows. Except... Ted hesitated, glanced around again. My grandfather said the dog wasn't waiting for Patterson to come back. It was guarding something, keeping people away from that particular stretch of road. The afternoon heat was building, but I felt cold. Guarding what? Ted stood, brushing dust from his trousers. That's where the stories get confused. Or maybe that's where people decided some stories were better left untold. He looked at me directly for the first time since we'd sat down. "You seem like a decent bloke, Davies. Take some advice. There's plenty of other routes between Melbourne and Brisbane." He walked away before I could ask anything else, leaving me sitting under the trees with more questions than I'd started with. The statue was visible from where I sat, a bronze dot against the highway backdrop. Even at this distance, I could swear it was watching. Back at the truck, I couldn't concentrate on the usual road preparations. Ted's story had hooked something in my brain, the way unsolved puzzles do. I'd always been drawn to local history. Hazard of spending so much time in small towns, I suppose. But this felt different. Personal somehow, like the statue's bronze eyes had been tracking my curiosity from the beginning. Instead of heading straight out for my next pickup, I drove back toward town and parked outside the Gundagai Historical Society. The building was one of those converted Victorian houses that small communities use for local museums, complete with hand-painted sign and volunteer hours that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. But the door was open, and a woman about my age was arranging display cases inside. "Help you with something?" she asked as I entered. Her name tag read Sarah Chen, and her expression suggested she didn't get many visitors who weren't either lost tourists or school groups. "I'm researching the dog on the Tuckerbox story," I said. "Specifically the original incident. Billy Patterson and what really happened in 1853. Sarah's hand stilled on the display case. That's specific. Most people just want to know if the dog was real. She studied me the way Ted had, looking for something. You're not writing a book, are you? Or making a documentary? Nothing like that. Just a truckie with too much curiosity for his own good. She seemed to relax slightly. Well, you've come to the right place, I suppose. Though I should warn you, the more you dig into the Patterson case, the less the official version makes sense. That was exactly what I'd hoped to hear. Sarah led me to a back room lined with filing cabinets and archive boxes, the kind of organized chaos that historians thrive in. She pulled out a thick folder marked Patterson, William, 1853, and spread its contents across a work table. I've been working on this for about 2 years, she said. Started as a simple verification project. The local council wanted to update the statue's plaque with more accurate historical details. But the more primary sources I found, the more questions arose. The documents were a mix of official reports, newspaper clippings, and handwritten letters, some so faded they were barely legible. Sarah had organized them chronologically, and even a quick scan revealed inconsistencies. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a police report dated 3 weeks after Patterson's disappearance. Constable Morrison writes that Patterson's remains were found approximately 12 miles northeast of last known position. But here, she flipped to another document, the coroner's report puts the location as 6 miles southwest of abandoned wagon. Could be different reference points. Maybe. But look at the dates. She traced her finger along the margins. The coroner examined the remains before the constable filed his location report. How do you examine remains you haven't found yet? I studied the papers more carefully. The discrepancies multiplied the deeper I looked. Patterson's cargo manifest listed, quote, mining equipment and general supplies, but witness statements described the abandoned wagon as containing, quote, personal effects only. The dog's behavior was mentioned in several accounts, but the descriptions varied wildly. Some called it devoted and mourning. Others described it as agitated and protective. And one report characterized it as displaying signs of distress consistent with recent trauma. What do you think really happened? I asked. Sarah gathered the documents back into neat piles. Honestly, I think Billy Patterson stumbled into something that got him killed. And I think powerful people made sure the investigation went away quietly. Any idea what he might have discovered? That's where it gets interesting. She pulled out a modern folder, clearly her own research notes. I started cross-referencing Patterson's delivery routes with other historical incidents from the same period. Turns out 1853 was a busy year for mysterious deaths along the transport corridors between Sydney and Melbourne. She showed me a hand-drawn map marking locations and dates. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. A string of incidents following the major freight routes, all involving men who worked in transport or communication. Bullock drivers, mail carriers, telegraph workers, all officially listed as natural deaths or accidents. Someone was cleaning house, Sarah said, eliminating people who might have seen too much, carried the wrong messages, asked the wrong questions. Patterson was just one victim in a much larger operation. And the dog? The dog became a problem when it wouldn't leave the scene. Animals have instincts about these things. It knew something bad had happened there. So someone decided to turn the problem into a solution. Create a sentimental story about loyalty and devotion. Build a statue to commemorate a fiction that would overshadow the facts. I thought about Ted's grandfather, about stories that were better left untold. But if you're right, why is this all coming to light now? The statue's been there for decades. Sarah's expression darkened. Because someone else has been asking the same questions. Someone with resources I don't have, and methods I wouldn't use. She hesitated. About 6 months ago, I started getting visitors. Not researchers or historians. People who wanted to know exactly what I'd found, who I'd talked to, where I'd gotten my information. Threatening? Not overtly. But the message was clear enough. Some secrets are supposed to stay buried. She began returning the documents to their folders. Then the reports started. Locals talking about changes around the statue. Strange atmosphere, fewer tourists. Like something was stirring that had been sleeping for a long time. I helped her pack away the papers, my mind racing. These visitors, did they give names? Professional courtesy. Business cards with company logos I'd never heard of. All very polite, very official. Sarah locked the filing cabinet and turned to face me. The thing is, Davies, I don't think they were trying to cover up the past. I think they were trying to prepare for something happening in the present. Outside, the afternoon was fading toward evening. The highway traffic had picked up. Commuters heading home. Long-haul drivers making their evening runs. Normal life proceeding normally, while underneath the surface, something much older and darker was beginning to stir. Sarah walked me to the door, then stopped. If you're planning to keep digging into this, be careful. Whatever killed Billy Patterson, whatever secret was worth murdering for in 1853, I don't think it went away. I think it just went underground. And now, someone's decided it's time to bring it back into the light. The address Sarah had reluctantly provided led me 12 kilometers out of town down a gravel road that wound through river-red gums and scrub. The property sat in a fold of hills, hidden from casual view. A weathered homestead surrounded by machinery sheds and holding yards. As I pulled up, an elderly woman emerged from the house, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to be wary of unexpected visitors. Behind her, a younger man, maybe 40, with the sun-weathered look of someone who spent his days outdoors, watched from the veranda. "Mrs. Patterson?" I called out, staying by my truck. She nodded slowly. "You'd be the truckie Sarah mentioned might come by. I told her what I told you. Some stories don't need retelling. I'm just trying to understand what happened to your ancestor. The real story." The younger man stepped forward. "I'm Dave Patterson. And you need to understand that the real story isn't something we talk about lightly." He gestured toward the house. "Come in. But what you hear here doesn't leave here. That's been our family's agreement for 5 generations. The interior of the homestead felt like stepping back in time. Heavy wooden furniture, faded photographs covering every available surface, the smell of old paper and wood polish. Mrs. Patterson poured tea with hands that shook slightly, while Dave settled into a chair that looked like it had been his father's and grandfather's before him. Billy Patterson was my great-great-grandfather, Dave began without preamble. But the man who died out there on the Hume wasn't hauling wool or timber. He paused, studying my face. He was carrying gold. Undeclared gold from claims that officially didn't exist. Mrs. Patterson set down her teacup with a sharp click. "Dave, she's right to be cautious," he continued, "because Billy wasn't working alone. He was part of a network. Bushrangers, corrupt officials, miners who'd found strikes they didn't want to register. They moved gold from secret claims down to Sydney, avoiding the government assayers and the official escort routes. I thought about Sarah's research, the pattern of deaths she'd identified. Someone found out. More than that." Dave pulled a wooden box from beside his chair, opened it to reveal a collection of letters tied with ribbon. Someone was already inside the operation. Billy kept records, names, dates, routes. He didn't trust his partners, and it turns out he was right not to. The letters were written in a careful hand, some pages stained with age and handling. As Dave selected one and unfolded it, I could see it was addressed to "My dear wife Margaret." "This is from Billy's last trip," Dave said, "posted from Albury, 3 days before he died." He began reading. "My darling, I fear this may be my final run. Thompson has been asking questions about routes I have not shared with him, and yesterday I saw Mackenzie in conversation with men I did not recognize. If something should happen to me, Remember that the true cache is not where we agreed, but where old Rex marks his territory each morning. Tell no one else this secret, for our children's sake. Thompson and Mackenzie, his partners in the gold operation, both died within 6 months of Billy. Mackenzie supposedly from a fall from his horse, Thompson from a fever. Dave refolded the letter carefully. But before they died, they turned on Billy. Sold him out to save themselves, though it didn't help them in the end. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. The dog wasn't just being loyal when it wouldn't leave that spot. Rex was guarding something. The gold Billy hid before they killed him. The implications hit me slowly. It's still there? Some of it. Dave opened another letter, this one in a different hand. This is from Margaret Patterson, Billy's wife, to her sister. Written 2 years after Billy died. He read, I took Rex back to the place, as Billy instructed. The poor creature led me straight to where he'd buried the strongbox. There was enough gold to buy this property and secure our children's future. But I left the rest where Billy hid it. Some wealth is too costly to claim. The rest? Billy was carrying more than one strongbox. Margaret only recovered what Rex showed her. The main cache, wherever Billy put it in those final hours, was never found. Dave returned the letters to their box. Every generation of our family has wondered about it. Some have looked, none have found it. Mrs. Patterson's voice was barely above a whisper. But now someone else is looking. Someone with equipment and resources we never had. I thought about Sarah's mysterious visitors, her warning about people with methods she wouldn't use. How do you know? Because they came here too, Dave said grimly. 6 months ago. Very polite, very professional. Wanted to know about family records, any documents or maps we might have inherited. When we told them we didn't have anything like that, they asked about the statue itself, whether we knew exactly where Billy's remains had been found, how precise the marker was. Did you tell them? We told them what everyone knows. The statue isn't where Billy died. It's beside the road, accessible to tourists. The actual site is about half a kilometer further south, in country too rough for tour buses. Mrs. Patterson stood abruptly and moved to the window, gazing out toward the darkening hills. They thanked us very politely and left. But that night, Dave found tire tracks on the boundary road. Someone had been watching the house. The next week, Dave continued, we heard about strange activity around the statue area. Lights at night, vehicles where they shouldn't be. The local police said they hadn't seen anything, but locals don't report things to police when they're not sure what they've seen. I remembered Ted's nervousness, the way other locals had clammed up when I'd asked questions. Someone's been conducting their own search. More than that, Mrs. Patterson said, still looking out the window. Someone's found something, or thinks they have. She turned back to us, her expression troubled. Last month, Dave drove out to the actual site. Show him, David. Dave pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo. It showed a patch of bush that looked largely undisturbed, except for several small holes. Precise, machine-drilled holes in a grid pattern. Ground-penetrating radar, he said. Professional survey work. Someone's been conducting a systematic search of the entire area. Any luck? Hard to say. But 3 weeks ago, the drilling stopped. Either they found what they were looking for, or they decided it wasn't there. Dave pocketed his phone. Either way, that's when the reports about the statue started. The atmosphere changing, tourists staying away, like something had shifted. Mrs. Patterson returned to her chair, suddenly looking every one of her 80-odd years. We've kept Billy's secret for over a century and a half. Protected the family name, let the world believe the tourist version of events. But now it feels like all that careful silence is unraveling. The gold, if someone found it, why would that affect the statue? Dave and his grandmother exchanged a look that carried generations of unspoken understanding. Because, Mrs. Patterson said finally, Billy wasn't the only one who died keeping that secret. And if someone's been digging in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions, disturbing things that were meant to stay buried, she trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's letter mentioned others, Dave said quietly, people who knew about the gold operation, who helped cover up what really happened. Some of them never left that stretch of country, and some secrets don't rest easy when they're disturbed. As I drove back toward town, the Pattersons' warnings echoed in my mind. The sun had fully set, and the highway was quiet except for the occasional truck making a night run. When I reached the turnoff to the dog on the Tuckerbox site, I found myself slowing, pulled by a curiosity that felt stronger than caution. The car park was empty except for my truck, and the silent bulk of the statue, illuminated by a single floodlight that cast harsh shadows across the memorial area. The tourist information boards and souvenir stands looked somehow smaller in the darkness, reduced to their actual significance in a story much larger and darker than they acknowledged. I walked slowly toward the statue and immediately understood what the locals had been trying to describe. The atmosphere was wrong, not just quiet, but expectant. Like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to hold its breath. The cheerful bronze dog looked somehow less benign in the harsh lighting, and the inscription praising loyalty and devotion felt like mockery. "Beautiful night for it, isn't it?" The voice came from behind me, calm and conversational. I turned to find a man in his 50s approaching from the shadows beyond the car park, well-dressed despite the remote location, carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone used to being in control. "For what?" I asked, fighting the urge to step back. "For finally putting old mysteries to rest." He gestured toward the statue with a slight smile. "You've been asking a lot of questions lately, talking to historians, visiting local families. Very thorough research. This had to be one of Sarah's mysterious visitors. Just interested in local history." "Oh, whoa, I think it's more than that." He moved closer, and I could see expensive boots, a watch that probably cost more than my truck, manicured hands that had never done manual labor. See, the thing about local history is that sometimes it's better left local. Sometimes outside interest can be disruptive. Disruptive to who? To everyone involved. Take the Patterson family, for instance. They've done an admirable job maintaining their ancestors' reputation for over a century. Turned a criminal into a folk hero. That takes dedication. His smile never wavered. It would be unfortunate if that careful work was undone by someone who didn't understand the bigger picture. I glanced toward my truck, calculating distances. What bigger picture? The picture where some secrets serve everyone better by staying buried, where tourist dollars keep flowing, local legends remain charming, and families don't have to explain why their pioneering ancestors were actually thieves and murderers. He followed my glance toward the truck. The picture where truck drivers stick to trucking instead of playing amateur historian. And if I don't? His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. A subtle readiness that suggested violence was always an available option. Well, that would depend on what you think you've learned, and what you plan to do with it. I thought about the Pattersons, fear, Sarah's warnings, Ted's nervous glances. About a community that had lived with carefully managed truth for generations. What I've learned is that Billy Patterson was mixed up in something that got him killed, that there might be gold still hidden out there, and that someone with resources is looking for it. Very good. And what you've also learned is that this is none of your business. He stepped closer. See, we're not just looking for gold. We're looking for closure. Billy Patterson's story has loose ends, and loose ends have a way of unraveling at inconvenient times. Better to tie them off cleanly. By threatening people? By protecting everyone's interests. The Patterson family keeps their respectability. The town keeps its tourist attraction. You keep your ability to drive trucks instead of spending time in hospital recovering from an unfortunate accident. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone. Everyone wins. But even as he spoke, I could see something else in his expression. a tension that suggested things weren't going entirely according to plan. Except you haven't found what you're looking for, have you? All that drilling, all that searching, and Billy's main cache is still out there. His smile faltered slightly. That's a temporary setback. Or maybe you're looking in the wrong place. Maybe the real secret isn't where Billy hid the gold. I was thinking out loud now, pieces falling together. Maybe it's why the dog wouldn't leave. Why locals get nervous talking about the statue. Why the atmosphere has changed. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that Billy Patterson wasn't the only one who died keeping that secret. And that disturbing one grave might have stirred up others. I looked past him toward the dark bush beyond the memorial site. Maybe the gold isn't the only thing still buried out there. For the first time, his composure cracked. That's superstitious nonsense. Is it? Then why are you here at midnight talking to me instead of continuing your search? Why do you look like someone who's encountered problems he didn't expect? I took a step toward my truck. Why does this place feel like it's watching us? He moved to block my path, and I could see his hand moving toward his jacket. Because people like you don't know when to leave things alone. Because amateurs always complicate situations that professionals could handle cleanly. Or because you've made the same mistake everyone else has made for the past 160 years. I kept my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. You've assumed this was just about gold and murder and covering up the past. You haven't considered that some things don't stay buried just because you put them in the ground. Enough! His hand emerged from his jacket holding something that glinted in the floodlight. You're going to walk back to your truck and drive away. You're going to forget everything you've heard about Billy Patterson and gold and family secrets. You're going to find a different route for your delivery runs that doesn't bring you through Gundagai. But as he spoke, the night around us seemed to shift. The harsh floodlight flickered, and in the momentary dimness, I could swear I saw movement in the shadows beyond the statue. Not the movement of living things, but something else, something that didn't belong to the present moment. He'd noticed it too. His head turned sharply, and the weapon in his hand wavered. What? That's what you've awakened, I said quietly. That's what the locals have been sensing. You didn't just disturb Billy Patterson's grave. You disturbed everything that was buried with his secret. The floodlight steadied, but the sense of presence remained, patient, watchful, and deeply angry. We were standing in a place where violence had occurred, where people had died for gold and secrets, where the official story had never acknowledged the real victims. And something about the recent disturbance had called attention to that injustice. "This is insane," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Then prove it. Go back out there in the dark and continue your search. Dig up the rest of Billy's secret and see what else you find." I took another step toward my truck, or accept that some mysteries are better left alone. For a moment, we faced each other across the small space between the statue and the car park, while the night pressed around us with weight and presence. Then his nerve broke. The weapon disappeared back into his jacket, and he backed away toward the shadows where he'd emerged. "This isn't over," he called out, but the threat sounded hollow now. "Yes," I said, climbing into my truck. "I think it is." 3 weeks later, I was back on the highway heading north through Gundagai, the familiar weight of my loaded trailer pulling behind me. The decision to return to this route hadn't been easy, but some things needed to be seen through to their proper conclusion. The confrontation at the statue had ended the immediate threat, but it had left too many questions unanswered, too many loose threads that would snag at my thoughts during the long hours on the road. The town looked the same as always from the highway. The gentle curve of the Murrumbidgee, the historic buildings clustered along the main street, the tourist signs pointing toward the famous statue. But I knew now that surfaces could be deceptive, that the stories we tell ourselves about places and people are often carefully constructed to hide more complicated truths. I'd spent those 3 weeks doing research of my own, making phone calls, following paper trails that led through old newspaper archives and government records. What I'd found wasn't the dramatic revelation I'd expected, but something more subtle and perhaps more troubling. A pattern of small omissions, minor adjustments to the historical record, questions that had been quietly discouraged rather than officially suppressed. The gold that Billy Patterson had stolen wasn't the fortune I'd imagined. It was a modest amount, the kind that might keep a man comfortable but wouldn't make him rich. The real crime hadn't been theft so much as betrayal. He'd taken money meant for the families of men who died in mining accidents, funds collected through the community to help widows and orphans survive the harsh realities of colonial life. When he'd been caught and killed, the money had disappeared with him, leaving those families with nothing but the charity of neighbors who had little enough to spare. That was the secret worth keeping. Not a dramatic tale of gold rush murder, but the more mundane tragedy of trust broken and suffering prolonged. The community had constructed its folklore around the loyal dog and the faithful bullocky, because that story served everyone better than the truth about stolen hope and abandoned responsibility. I pulled into the truck stop where this had all begun, noting that Sarah was working the counter. She looked up as I entered, and I saw recognition in her eyes along with something that might have been relief. "Back on the Gundagai run?" she asked as she rang up my coffee and meat pie. "Seemed like the right thing to do," I said. "How have things been around here?" "Quieter." She handed me my change with a meaningful look. "That fellow who was asking questions about the statue, he packed up his equipment and left town the day after your last visit. Said something about pursuing other opportunities. And the statue itself? Back to normal, according to the locals. Whatever was bothering people about it seems to have settled down." She paused, studying my face. "I wanted to thank you, by the way. You'd understand what for." I did understand. Word traveled fast in small towns, and the story of what had happened that night at the statue would have spread through the community's informal networks within hours. Not the full story that would remain between the people directly involved, but enough to let everyone know that the recent disturbance had been resolved. "Tell everyone they're welcome," I said, "and tell them I'll be coming through on this route regularly. Some roads are worth staying on." The drive through town took me past the Historical Society, where I could see Sarah's car in the parking lot. She was probably still working on her research, finding other mysteries that could benefit from proper academic attention, ones where the truth might actually help people instead of just satisfying curiosity. The statue came into view as I rounded the familiar curve, and I slowed the truck despite the traffic behind me. The dog on the Tuckerbox sat in its usual place, weathered bronze catching the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by its neat border of tourist amenities. Nothing about it suggested the drama that had played out here just weeks earlier, the confrontation between past and present that had briefly threatened to tear open old wounds. But I could see the subtle signs that things had changed. The ground around the statue's base had been carefully restored, the disturbed earth tamped down and reseeded with grass that was just beginning to show green. Someone had placed fresh flowers at the base of the monument. Not the formal wreaths that tourist groups sometimes left, but simple wildflowers that might have been gathered from the surrounding countryside. A local gesture, acknowledging something that couldn't be spoken about directly. More telling was what I didn't see. The historical marker that had stood beside the statue for decades, the one that told the sanitized version of Billy Patterson's story, had been removed. In its place was a simpler plaque, one that spoke in general terms about the hardships faced by early travelers and the bonds between working people and their animals. The specific claims about Patterson's character and fate had been quietly eliminated, leaving space for visitors to appreciate the statue without being led toward any particular interpretation of the history behind it. I pulled over into the car park, ignoring the diesel engine's protests as it settled into idle. A few tourists wandered around the monument, taking the usual photographs and reading the new plaque with casual interest. None of them seemed troubled by mysteries or hidden meanings. For them, this was simply another roadside attraction, a pleasant break in their journey through the Australian countryside. Walking closer to the statue, I noticed one more change that probably only I would recognize as significant. Someone had cleaned the bronze more thoroughly than usual, removing not just the surface dirt and oxidation but also the subtle discoloration that had been building up for years in certain spots. The dog's expression seemed clearer now, more distinct, as if some film had been lifted from its features. But it was still the same statue, still telling the same basic story about loyalty and endurance. The difference was in what surrounded it. The removal of false certainty, the acknowledgement that some aspects of history were too complex to be captured in simple narratives carved in bronze and stone. "You came back." I turned to find Janet Patterson approaching from the direction of the town, her expression unreadable. She looked older than when I'd first met her, as if the recent events had taken a toll that went beyond simple stress or worry. "I did," I said. "Felt like I owed the place that much." "And what do you think of what you see?" I gestured toward the clean statue, the restored ground, the modified signage. "I think it looks like a community that's found a way to live with its past without being crushed by it." She nodded slowly. "That's what we hoped for. What we've always hoped for, really. But it took someone from outside to help us see how to get there." "The man who was digging around your family's old property?" "Gone for good, according to the police. Turns out he had a history of this kind of thing, treasure hunting on other people's land, making threats when he didn't get cooperation. When they questioned him about what happened here, he decided he'd rather pursue his interests somewhere else. And the gold, Billy's secret." Janet's smile was sad but peaceful. "Still out there somewhere, I suppose. Still buried with the truth about what he really did and why he died for it. But now, it can stay buried. The people who were hurt by his actions are long dead, and their descendants have found other ways to survive and prosper. Digging up that pain wouldn't serve anyone except treasure hunters and sensation seekers." I understood the wisdom in that choice, even as part of me wondered about the historical record and the value of complete truth. But I'd learned enough about the complexities of the past to know that sometimes the most ethical choice was to let sleeping truths lie undisturbed. "What about Sarah and her research?" "She's found plenty of other stories to investigate. Turns out there are dozens of historical mysteries around here that could benefit from proper academic attention, ones where the truth might actually help people instead of just satisfying curiosity." We stood together in comfortable silence, watching the tourists complete their circuit of the statue and head back toward their cars. Normal people living normal lives, pausing briefly to acknowledge a piece of folklore that connected them to something larger than their immediate concerns. "There's one more thing," Janet said as I prepared to return to my truck. "Something you should probably know before you make this drive a regular part of your route." I waited, recognizing the tone of someone preparing to share a confidence. "The night you confronted that man here at the statue, you weren't wrong about sensing something unusual. Something beyond just the tension and the danger of the moment." "What do you mean?" "My great-grandmother used to tell stories about this place, about things that happened here in the years after Billy Patterson died. Travelers who stopped here for the night and reported strange dreams. Voices in the wind that sounded like conversations from long ago. Nothing harmful, nothing threatening. Just reminders that some places hold on to the memory of significant events." She looked toward the statue, her expression thoughtful. "We've always known this was one of those places. Part of why the community was so protective of the official story, not just because the truth was painful, but because we understood that this ground held more than just buried metal and old bones. And now it feels settled. Peaceful in a way it hasn't been for years, maybe decades. Whatever was stirred up by that man's digging and threats, it's been put to rest properly." I thought about that night, about the sense of presence I'd felt in the shadows around the statue, the feeling that we were being watched by something that cared deeply about justice and truth. Perhaps what we'd achieved wasn't just the preservation of community harmony, but something more fundamental, the honoring of old pain without perpetuating it, the acknowledgement of injustice without creating new victims in the process of exposing it. "Thank you for telling me," I said, "and for trusting me with the whole story. Thank you for understanding what to do with it." As I drove away from Gundagai, continuing north with my load of goods and my cargo of new understanding, I found myself thinking about the nature of folklore and its relationship to truth. The story of the dog on the Tuckerbox had always been more than just entertainment or tourist attraction. It was a way for the community to express its values, to honor the virtues of loyalty and perseverance without getting bogged down in the complexities of individual human failings. The real Billy Patterson had been neither the heroic bullocky of folklore nor the simple villain that some historical accounts might have painted him. He'd been a man who'd made a terrible choice in desperate circumstances, who'd betrayed his community's trust in a moment of weakness or greed, and who'd paid for that betrayal with his life. The people who'd killed him had probably believed they were serving justice, but they'd also created a cycle of secrecy and shame that had persisted for generations. By preserving the folklore while quietly abandoning the false historical claims, the community had found a way to honor what deserved honoring while releasing what needed to be released. The statue could continue to represent the best impulses of human and animal partnership, without carrying the weight of specific lies about specific people who'd lived and died in complicated circumstances. That felt like wisdom, practical, messy, and human. Some truths served the living, while others served only the dead or the merely curious. Learning to distinguish between them was perhaps one of the most important skills anyone could develop, whether they were academics or truck drivers, or simply people trying to make sense of the stories that shaped their understanding of the world. The highway stretched ahead of me, familiar and comfortable, carrying me toward my next delivery and my next set of encounters with the endless complexity of human experience. But I carried with me now a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance between truth and kindness, between the demands of history and the needs of community, between the stories we tell and the realities we choose to face or leave buried. Behind me, the dog on the Tuckerbox sat in the afternoon sunlight, keeping its faithful watch over a stretch of road where countless travelers had passed and would continue to pass, most of them unaware of the layers of meaning and history that surrounded them. That seemed exactly as it should be. Some knowledge was meant to be earned through experience and reflection, not simply handed over to anyone who happened to be curious enough to ask the right questions. The road called, and I answered, carrying my cargo toward whatever story waited around the next bend. If you've ever driven the long road at night, you know the silence that settles between towns, the weight of stories that every landmark carries. Hit like and subscribe. More stories are coming.